We had a discussion about the transition from stagflation to the supply side economic policies of Ronald Reagan that lasted into the early 1990s. And now we need to talk about the Reagan foreign policy. What else was going on in the United States during the 1980s that's significant and the Regents exam might ask you about? And then we will briefly discuss the 1990s, which would be the George H.W. Bush and Bill Clinton presidencies. Starting with Reagan's foreign policy, really targeting anti-communist efforts around the world became a high priority for Ronald Reagan. He considered continued support for the Mujahideen in Afghanistan, which was the resistance against the Soviet Union. It began under President Carter's administration, and Ronald Reagan not only continued it, but expanded upon it. There was U.S. involvement in Grenada to prevent a communist takeover of their government in 1983. And then there was a very controversial Iran-Contra affair in which weapons were sold to Iran in exchange for money that was then used to fund Contras in Nicaragua, which was an anti-communist militia that was resisting communist efforts in Nicaragua. This is an extremely controversial moment in history, and it comes back up when Reagan's vice president, George Bush, runs for president. How much did you know about the Iran-Contra affair at the time that it took place? It was a major question in the presidential campaign. Not only was communism resisted globally, but Reagan also began a renewed nuclear arms race with the Soviet Union, and ultimately this bankrupted the Soviet Union. The United States could afford to reinvest in its nuclear arsenal. The Soviet Union could not without spending in crushing amounts of deficits. And the Berlin Wall fell in 1989, and the Soviet Union itself collapsed 2 years later in 1991. You can see a photograph here of Ronald Reagan meeting with Mujahideen leaders in the White House. And many of these leaders, it is criticized how much aid the United States gave them because none other than Osama bin Laden was a member of the Mujahideen in the 1980s. You can see here there's actually false stories about this photograph. That's two reasons I want to show this to you. Was one, that this went around the internet falsely, claiming that this was Osama bin Laden meeting with Jimmy Carter's national security advisor, and that's not true. He was, however, a member of the Army of Pakistan that was working with the Mujahideen to resist the Soviet Union in Afghanistan. So even though this is not Osama bin Laden, despite rumors of it being him on the internet, it is still not a very flattering photograph for a former national security advisor to a president of the United States to be consorting with someone who, upon retrospect, could be considered a terrorist. So this leads to, and I'm sorry this got cut off, it didn't transition onto the slide very well, but a political meme in which a photo of Osama bin Laden is labeled trained by the CIA, funded by the American taxpayer, because of how much money had been given to the Mujahideen during the 80s. So positives and negatives come out of Reagan's foreign policy. His policies are almost single-handedly credited with crippling the Soviet Union, but on the flip side, also contributing to threats to national security later in American history. Another majorly important thing that happens while Reagan is in office is the New Jersey versus TLO decision in 1985. I have a series of cartoons here that can kind of explain to you the play-by-play of what happened and what the decision was. So as the story in New Jersey versus TLO goes, a high school student is caught smoking in the girls' bathroom. This person naturally is sent to the office. While in the office, she denies smoking, says, "Nope, I don't smoke, I don't know what you're talking about." And the principal grabs the student's purse and says, "We are going to confiscate the cigarettes from your purse." And she says, "You can't do that. I have a right to privacy. You can't look through my things." Well, they do look through her things, and when they look through them, they find that she has marijuana. She continues to claim that's illegal, that's a violation of my rights, and the two major arguments being argued before the Supreme Court were the students' rights not violated? What reasonable belief of illegal activity led to the search? She smoked a cigarette in the bathroom. How does that lead you to believe she has marijuana in her purse? However, the school officials argued, and their attorneys argued, that they were acting in loco parentis and could not be bound by the Fourth Amendment. All in loco parentis means is that school districts act in the place of parents when kids go to school. So they're looking out for the best interest of kids while they're in school, just as a parent would. So if a parent caught their kid smoking, a parent would go through their kids' things. So the argument was actually won by the school district and their attorneys, saying that searches are reasonable given very specific circumstances, and as long as the search was not extensively intrusive in light of the age and sex of the student and the nature of the infraction. So if a student is caught vandalizing something, you're not going to search their belongings. Whereas a student caught smoking in the bathroom, there is a certain amount of reasonableness under the circumstances that you have reason to believe they have cigarettes. So how acceptable is it or isn't it for a school official to search a student, their belongings, or their locker? Justice Byron White, pictured here on the left, said, given reasonable circumstances and not an overly intrusive search, it would be acceptable for school districts to search a student. So after Ronald Reagan leaves office, his vice president, George H.W. Bush, is elected president and serves one term. We'll come back to why he was only a one-term president in a moment. A couple of things that he is known for during his presidency is the United Nations Security Council action against Iraq when it invaded Kuwait. The U.S. led a UN coalition to push Iraq out of Kuwait. Operation Desert Storm is really all that what I call Daddy Bush is known for, other than he did make this blanket promise during the 1988 presidential campaign, read my lips, no new taxes. And then during his presidency, there was indeed a tax increase, and that beat him over the head in his next presidential campaign against Bill Clinton. Another thing that happened while Bush was in office, but had been something that was developing for years and years and years, is the Americans with Disabilities Act. So you can't really give a lot of credit to the Congress at the time or to Bush himself, because this is something that had been an ongoing struggle, much like women's suffrage or the civil rights movement. So this was a long movement that happened to culminate in the Americans with Disabilities Act during George H.W. Bush's presidency. And all this means is that it prohibits discrimination based on any disability. This is particularly important for access to buildings. There are buildings codes now that must be what's known as ADA compliant, which means somebody who is disabled should be able to have just as much a chance to access that building as anyone else. Any new construction and any renovations to existing construction would need to be ADA compliant from that day forward. President Bill Clinton defeated President Bush not only because of the no new taxes pledge, but because of a recession that was happening amidst the election. And as we learned under Jimmy Carter, when you are president at the time of a recession, whether it's your fault or not, you often are suffering the brunt of it. So President Bush loses to Bill Clinton, a former Arkansas governor, and now President of the United States as of the 1992 election. So what is he known for? Well, the North American Free Trade Agreement, very hotly debated, was praised at the time as good for trade and would increase business transactions and revenue. It is heavily criticized today as something that was a tax-free haven for corporations to send jobs overseas. And this was actually renegotiated in recent years as a new agreement between Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So a newer version of NAFTA exists today with additional restrictions beyond what existed under NAFTA. He also instituted in his presidency in 1994 the don't ask, don't tell policy. And essentially that means that homosexuals cannot be openly gay in the military, but are allowed to serve as long as they keep their sexuality a secret. So he signed this into law in 1994. It was reversed by President Obama in 2010. And this is kind of a null and void issue today anyway because of the Obergefell v. Hodges same-sex marriage decision, which I'll come back to here in a moment, that says you cannot deny rights based on sexual orientation. So the Defense of Marriage Act. This defined marriage as between a man and a woman. President Clinton signed this into law in 1996, but many laws, and since a Supreme Court decision in the 2008 to present era, have sided with the individual and supported same-sex marriage. So you have, in particular, Obergefell v. Hodges, which, don't quote me on this, I want to believe was 2014. And Obergefell v. Hodges says that you cannot deny a marriage license to two consenting adults. And what that means is that you cannot deny a marriage to two consenting adults. That doesn't mean that, private services such as bakeries baking a cake, florists providing flowers, have to participate in a same-sex ceremony. And that is because of the current view of religious liberty, that if it's somebody's religious belief that homosexuality is wrong, and therefore they do not want to participate in a same-sex marriage ceremony in any way, shape, or form, they are currently under the law allowed to do so. Do not be surprised at all if you see additional litigation on this issue, because if you remember all the way back to the Civil Rights era, you had Plessy versus Ferguson saying that segregation was perfectly acceptable. Separate but equal, if you remember. Nobody ever enforced the equal part of things, but that's besides the point that I'm trying to make right now. That was overturned in public facilities like schools, courthouses, etc. by Brown versus Board of Education in 1954. Private businesses still discriminated at that point, though. Restaurants, hotels would discriminate based on race, and it was perfectly legal to do so until Heart of Atlanta Motel versus U.S., a decision later in the 60s that was decided that including private businesses could not discriminate based on race. So you might see in the future Obergefell v. Hodges has secured the right to marry, and you may see follow-up court cases that say whether or not the current view of religious liberty in denying service to someone based on their marriage going to be same-sex marriage, that remains to be seen, but don't surprise yourself if you see that in coming years, a decision on that exact scenario. President Clinton was involved in a very controversial situation in which he had had a sexual relationship with a White House intern by the name of Monica Lewinsky. It wasn't so much that he had been inappropriate. Certainly people didn't like that, but he was impeached actually in 1998 for lying under oath, which is known as perjury, and for intentionally interfering with an ongoing investigation. That's called obstruction of justice. So he was impeached not because of the inappropriate relationship, but because of the perjury and obstruction of justice. Now, he was not convicted, so he was not forced to leave office. But some visuals here, you can see Time magazine where they were covering the Lewinsky scandal, and you can also see two photographs here that are in direct contrast to each other. One in which President Clinton was wagging his finger at the camera saying, "I did not have sexual relations with this woman," and then later appearing on television to say, "I indeed had an inappropriate relationship." So he stuck to very, very legal terms that would protect him from admitting perjury, but had he simply fessed up from the beginning, he likely would not have been impeached. So very, very controversial time in the late 90s. Nothing to that point was quite as controversial, however, as the election of 2000, in which President Bush won by a very slim electoral margin despite being the popular vote loser, and a Supreme Court decision had to be issued in order to declare the outcome of the election. Still very controversial to this day. President Bush won enough electoral votes, but had won the state of Florida by a matter of hundreds of votes. So it was very, very controversial who was actually the winner, and it was this court decision that halted recounts that were going on at the time, and President Bush became president officially after that court decision. That's the end of the presentation. If you have any questions, don't hesitate to reach out. Otherwise, I'll see you in class.